Welcome to The Victory Show.
Hey, Victors, welcome back to another episode of The Victory Show. If this is your first time joining us, I'm Travis Cody, best-selling author of 19 books and creator of Bestseller by Design. I've had the privilege of helping hundreds of business consultants, founders, and entrepreneurs write and publish their own best-selling books. And through that journey, I've discovered a really fascinating pattern. Most businesses really struggle to break past that seven-figure per year mark in revenue. So on this show, I sit down with some of the world's most successful founders, CEOs, leaders, and business owners to uncover the strategies that they used to scale their way past that mark so you can do the same. So get ready for some deep insights and actionable takeaways that you can implement in your life and your business starting now. Now, today's guest is a powerhouse at the intersection of business, technology, and also social good. Laura Kneedler is an accomplished CEO with a track record of leading organizations to both financial performance and meaningful community impact. And remember that, because we're going to come back. It's an important part of our conversation. Across healthcare, technology, and education sectors, she has worked alongside Fortune 50 companies to advance accessibility initiatives and currently leads a mission-driven enterprise that operates commercial ventures to fund transformative programs for individuals with disabilities. And Laura's not only an executive leader, she's also a strategic advisor, sought after speaker who helps other leaders build high performing teams, sharpen their strategy, and design growth that actually lasts. Go figure. Not just growth for growth's sakes. So, whether she's scaling a company or expanding a mission, Laura brings heart, insight, and execution to everything she touches. Laura, thanks so much for taking time out of your day to be here.
Thanks for having me, Travis. Happy to be here.
All right. So, part of what you do is building leadership teams, and that seems to be such a struggle for so many corporations. I think, the whole idea of the middle manager cliche is cliche for a reason.
hmm
But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about your upbringing because you grew up in what I would think most people would say, "Oh, how do you go from there to working with Fortune 50?" You grew up in Montana, correct?
I did. Yes, I grew up in Helena, Montana, which is, about 80,000 people now, but at the time was even smaller. But, I do think even growing up in a small community, I was around a lot of kind of entrepreneurial people. And so that definitely helped kind of guide my journey, I guess, into the space I'm in now.
So were you around entrepreneurs when you were young? Was that family members or just people in the community?
Yeah, family members. My grandfather owned his own business. My father did for a while also. But I feel like also growing up in a place like Montana where you have kind of really significant like weather swings. It sounds very silly, but and it's more rural. You have a lot of grit. Like people have a lot of kind of
Mm,
internalized grit because you need that to sort of survive. And so I really think that some of it comes just from that, like being around people who also like were ranchers or farmers and lived kind of hard lives, if you will. And so
sure.
taking a lot of the skills that I saw in other people, just kind of that work ethic, you have to work hard for what you want to get. And so I feel like that was just instilled in me, at a young age, and allowed me to kind of be where I am today.
Well, I think that's important too. I grew up in a small town. My parents have had a small farm. They still have a small farm. Even though in their 70s, chickens, cows, ducks, geese. I mean, they're still self-sustainable. And I think to what you're saying, when you grow up or in a farming community, to see just the physical labor that people go through on a day-to-day basis. When I moved to Hollywood and worked in as a screenwriter for a while, being in the city and sort of talking to people that were just kind of disconnected from that, to me it was a little sad, right? And I think it was sad because they didn't have any sort of gratitude for like how hard some people are working to get food on their table.
Right.
But that doesn't that inform you that. So as you've gone through your career, and we'll get into sort of the journey of that, like that word grit, I really like. And like, how do you like for you, you kind of grew up that way, but are there ways that you're able to sort of identify that in teams you're working with to identify like who is going to be like maybe a better leader than others?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's something, I feel like I'm a fairly intuitive person, so I have an easier time reading people,
Mm,
which I think helps me build really strong teams. And I would say, the things that I look for in people when I think about grit or like that kind of resiliency, is that sort of, kind of cliche, but it's that kind of go-getter. Like you can tell that someone is really passionate about what they're doing. They're plugged into it, but also they will take the time to listen to, and gather feedback because I feel like most successful leaders have to find that balance of how do we, put create a vision, push people forward, move people along in the direction we're wanting them to go. But, how do we do that and balance getting input and feedback from the people who are going to help us get there?
mm,
And so I think that people that can balance and navigate both of those kind of two sides of the spectrum, um, really charging ahead, driving the team forward, and also listening. I think they are kind of the most successful leaders in my experience.
mm.
And I think I think being able to recognize that in other people, a lot of the times, I think that looks like emotional intelligence. Can someone communicate and have a conversation that's reciprocal, kind of that back and forth, not completely one-sided. But yeah, I do think it's a skill, and I do think it's a skill that also evolves over time. I think even the best leaders, it's not something you wake up and know how to do really, really well. It's something that,
What?
yeah, I know, right? Would that be nice if it was? But I do think it's something that builds over time, and you really have to work at it also, and you have to be willing to put in that work.
Mm. So when you work with like, so if companies hire you to come in and consult, so let's say that I've got, I don't know, I'm just going to make this up. Let's say I've got a $5 million a year revenue company. I've got a team of, let's say I was lucky and got there with 10 or 12, but we're, going from 5 to 10 is stopping us. And it's all because of our internal sort of protocols. What do you do? What do you like, how do you approach taking a company like that to help them build out the support, the leadership team that they need to be able to actually scale a business?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that it does start at the top, and so sort of assessing that, who is in place in terms of kind of who's at the leadership table. And a lot of the times, because they are the people that are going to form the vision and really drive the direction. And if they're not clear on what they're doing, so a lot of that looks like strategy. It's like, is there a clear strategy in place? Do people have a plan for how they're going to get from 5 million, not even just 5 million to 10 million? How are you going to get from 5 million to 6 million?
Hmm.
Um, and so do they have a strategy in place that will work? And if they don't, then, let's look at that. Do they have the right people in the right places? Because I do think a lot of the times, building a successful team is all about aligning people with their, finding the right people and the right talent, but also aligning them with the right skill sets and the right activities. And many people, especially in companies, because, I do tend to work more in kind of that healthcare education, human service space. And that can come with some sort of legacy employees, if you will. And so it can be hard for people to say, so and so's been here for, 10 years, 15 years, and they've always had this role. And so some of it sometimes is making hard decisions about, how do we make sure that those right people are in the right place?
That's got to be challenging when somebody's been there for 15 years in a job and you're going, but they're not suited for that job. That's not a good fit for them. Right? Because
Yeah,
especially get your identity tied up at that point in time, right?
absolutely. I think it is very challenging. And, there's always, and I think that's the hardest part about leading any company is that people aspect. And, you know, people have a lot of feelings about whenever you make change about whatever, but I also think, I try to keep people focused on what is the goal? What are you trying to accomplish? And if you don't have the right people in place to do that, you probably aren't going to get there. You might get some of the way there, and it's not a personal thing. You have to sort of figure out how to, um, put some of those feelings aside to be able to make those hard decisions. And I think it's easier in the space I'm in because, as you mentioned, a lot of it is based around that kind of social or community impact. The goal for most of the companies I work for is, maximizing that. And so there's always that piece, that sort of mission or people component to balance out and say, we're doing this for good, not only to make the sure that the company is profitable, but also so we can maximize services for the people that
Mm.
we're, working with.
So let's talk a little bit about strategy. Like, let's say that somebody kind of got to where they got to, just sort of, charismatic leader and flying by the seat of their pants, but then they hit a point where it's like, we've been stuck here for 3 years or 5 years, right? So when you go into that situation and they share the strategy with you, and the strategy is like, let's just do more of what we were doing.
Yeah.
Where do you start from there? How do you help someone design a strategy? And then there's a second part of that question, but let's talk about where do we go with just building strategy first and foremost? What does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think a lot of it is really looking at what are kind of the current, where are our strengths? What are we doing well right now? And how do we do more of that? What are the things that are tripping us up, and what are the kind of threats or competitive factors that are coming into play that might, either be limiting our market share, it might be, limiting our ability to, I feel like workforce is a big component. Like a lot of
Mm,
companies are struggling with how do we find the people, especially like frontline staff to do the work. Um, and so, I think there's kind of understanding that, kind of doing that analysis to be like, what are we really good at and what is hanging us up? And being really honest and, radically transparent about like, these are the real things that are tripping us up. And then figuring out how do we solve for some of those and how do we move forward? And what type of a plan or goals do we need to put in place to get us there? Um, and do we have a clear vision? Because I do think that that's I think having a vision that's just solely based on, profit, can be really tricky. Just saying, I just want to grow by $1 million because that's what we did the last 2 years. There's got to be a little more meat in to the bone there. And
mm,
so really helping leaders identify like the why behind that. Like, but what else are you really trying to do? Why does this bring them back to sort of that origin story of like, what is your purpose? Why does this company exist? Um, and trying to
mm.
help them kind of figure that out to get really clear on that, and then making sure they stick to that, and sort of like, now that's what we're living and breathing, we're creating communication and messaging around that so that, everyone in the organization understands their role in helping to achieve that strategy or that plan. Um,
I love it. All right, so if you've gone into an organization that didn't have much of a vision or strategy and you take the time to build that out, what are the steps then that you've got to go through to actually get buy-in from the people who are going to be implementing that on a day-to-day basis?
yeah, I think that's where the kind of that listening and the feedback comes in play is, you know, develop the strategy and the vision, but then you really need to kind of touch base with all the stakeholders. Like, who do you need to have on on board in order to make this thing go? It doesn't mean you need to talk to every single person, but you have to have some way to sort of get a pulse on how are the people that are going to kind of make or break your business, how are they feeling about this? And what do they want to see, what's important to them? Because then, if you can, and I don't think I've ever encountered a time where you can't take someone's feedback, and say, here's where this fits in. And it doesn't have to be a perfect match. It's not that you're doing everything that everyone, every wish that everyone has, but it's really taking those little nuggets of like, these are the themes. This is what we're hearing kind of resonates or doesn't resonate with people. Um, and then putting those into kind of those tangible goals and helping. And that is where that, like, I do think it's kind of the internal marketing piece. I think marketing is such a huge
That's that's a good phrase right there. Internal marketing, where
Yeah,
everybody's so focused on the external marketing, but
exactly.
nobody's talking about the internal marketing.
No, and that
Trademark that. That's a good brand right there.
exactly. And I mean, really, I think that's a lot of people overlook that piece. And it is, in my opinion, one of the most important pieces about, if you're going to have a successful company or not, is that focus on that internal messaging and making sure that people can align to what you're saying. Because then that helps to build momentum, and it's kind of, I've seen people achieve a lot more when they get that buy-in.
I love it. All right, so let's talk about stages of leadership then. Let's, obviously you've got your company, but somebody comes in, they start, you can tell that they're hungry. Like, what are things that you do as a business owner to nurture the leaders inside of your own company? That's to just say that you've got somebody that just finished a master's degree, they've been with you a couple of years, but it's clear that they're like, they've got a clear vision for what they want. What are the things that you do to help kind of nurture that when you see it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that and I will say, like, I think that the workforce has changed, just in the sense that, we used to see people sticking with in particular fields for a long time. It'd be like, I'm a career teacher, career banker, whatever it is. And now we see that less and less. People are moving around to different things. They're wanting to, and and I think a lot of leaders are still a little afraid of that. I think the best ones are embracing and understanding that that's kind of not the reality that we're in anymore.
Yeah.
And
The
um,
golden watch is a bygone era.
exactly, exactly. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there too. And so I always try to view it and remind my teams that it's actually really, it can be a great opportunity and great success to say, hey, we started someone out, someone started in our company at this level, and they stayed with us for X number of years. We helped them grow, and then they went off and launched their own thing. That's a success in my book. And I think it's making that kind of mental mind shift to say, when people leave, that's actually a good thing. Especially if they're going out to do things that you're like, yeah, we helped set them up for that. And so, some of the ways that I go about doing that for team members is, what internal pathways do we have? Do we have any set up or established to where they can kind of, come in at a lower level in the organization and then work their way up? Do we have kind of those career ladders? What professional development opportunities and trainings do we have in place? Um, because then also, it does help with sort of that front end of the workforce, with frontline staff. If you're getting people in and saying, hey, we're going to help you grow, that's what we were committed to doing. We want to see that. Um, so I just think it's really about kind of creating those opportunities and making that part of your internal culture, of the company, of saying this is something that we embrace and that we really want to see happening. And then again, celebrate it as a success when we see people actually working through those pathways.
Yeah, I've worked with companies that have been dysfunctional, and then I had a fairly significant. I worked with an international company for a while, and I remember having a conversation with their CEO, and we were talking about visions and goals, right? And we were talking about everything, and I still remember where he said something where I made a comment about, well, this is kind of what I'm doing, and he stopped. And he says, he's like, I can appreciate that you want to be loyal to the company and everything, and he's like, but look, if you're still working with us in 2.5 years, I have failed. He's
Hmm.
like, our goal is to bring you in and work with us and grow you so that you can move on and start your own business and do your own thing. That was the first time I had ever, this was a huge company. I think they were at the time that I huge, medium-sized company. They were doing about 40 million a year. But it was just like so shocking for me to have a leader go, oh, if you're still working with us in 2 years, we've failed our job of like getting you ready for the next sort of phase that you need to be
Right.
in. Um,
Absolutely.
you said something earlier about just being able to embrace transparency, especially inside of a company, of being willing to admit, like, this is where we actually are. Have you found over this last 5 to 10 years that the acceptance of and willingness to be transparent is changing, especially around business leaders? in terms of being more open to it versus like, oh no, we
Yeah,
can't admit this stuff to our employees. This is only like C-suite only conversations.
I think so. And I think a lot of that honestly is coming from pressure from the workforce itself. You
Mm.
know, newer generations and younger generations are really they're into like we want to know um we want to know all the things. We want to know why we want to feel like we're connected to wherever we're working. We want to understand kind of the why behind things. And I do think that's a really significant shift from what the workforce used to look like. And so I've seen a lot of leaders sort of struggle with that. And how do we accept this? Like, and where's the line, right? Of like, here's what we share, here's what we don't share. Because I do still think there's a line in the sense that you can't give all the context and the reason behind
Sure.
everything to everyone. You just can't. But I do think that, and I have seen people respond, much better when they do feel like, hey, you really are trying to be as transparent as possible with me. I understand that there are things you're not going to share or can't share or whatever. And I think building that into, I try to help leaders build that into their organizational culture of, let's find that line, what feels okay, but it's sort of not, I kind of view it as like, it's not really an option anymore. They're going to push you, um, to be this way now. And you can either embrace it and be successful, or you can, not. And I think people do still get stuck there sometimes.
Sure. Well, I think that's also how you get people to buy into a vision, right? Here's the
Yeah,
vision, but then giving the like, here's what, hey, that next year we want to grow to $6 million per in revenue. Why?
yeah,
Right. Well, here's you give them the markers of this is how we're going to do it. And this is why it's important. This is and then what you said, tie it back into the mission, right?
yeah,
Again, I've had experiences with companies that just every year they'd come out and be like, here's our new vision and mission. And everybody's like, I don't, what does this even mean? And then there's no clarity around it. And then like, 3 weeks later, people are just like kind of back to it's ignoring it, right? Moving on.
right.
Cause there was no, just that came from up above and nobody knew why. And there was no buy-in. So
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, I think for a long time, it's sort of people use sort of that kind of visioning, planning, the strategy piece is more of a checkbox of like, did we do this? Check,
the
check.
McKinsey checkbox, did you do that? Check.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's where you run if you're not kind of seeing that all the way through that process of like, you have to give it sort of the weight and importance that it deserves in order for it to actually work.
Hmm.
And that means kind of following that all the way through. Like I said, that internal marketing piece,
Internal
selling
marketing.
it to your
I think
teams.
you're onto something with that. That's really fantastic. So you've had the opportunity and the privilege, maybe it's not a privilege, but to work with Fortune 50 companies.
Hmm.
Right? So there's a lot of mystique and sort of business aura around that. So what are some of the lessons that you've learned from being able to kind of work with entities that are, working at that level?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the kind of interesting things, and a lot of the companies I worked with, it was really around how do we solve for some of the challenges, some of the biggest business challenges, whether that's attracting and retaining talent, maximizing operational efficiency and workflows. Um, and so I think, being kind of called in to be a solution, that was that's it was helpful. And I think for the most part, a really good experience in most cases. I think, in some of the kind of ventures that we had with that were a lot of them were around creating accessibility initiatives. So one example is a virtual assistant for blind and low vision executives in large tech companies.
Wow.
And, so really creating this, service line, but it was human based. And so that was a really interesting kind of component. And but these people are already employed, these executives were already employed in these tech companies, and coming in and figuring out, one, it took a really, and I have to say, give a lot of credit to the people in those companies, because all of those happened because there was at least one kind of champion who was willing to sort of listen to our pitch around, hey, we think we can help you solve some of these issues. And in kind of a unique way, and with a group, people who identify as having a disability in a workforce, that's kind of a unique space. And so it really often took kind of one internal champion, usually higher up in the company, to listen to that. And then once they did and saw we were able to get in there and really demonstrate that this is really successful, and we're actually, you know, saving people that you've already employed 20 hours a week just by taking away some of these barriers that were unintended, but kind of helping them navigate their work environment. And so that was, I think having that internal champion in those companies was really necessary and helpful. Um, but it was a really interesting experience also, just trying to figure out, like, because we were really small, small kind of social enterprise at the time. And um mashing that culture up with, a gigantic global tech company, um, was interesting, and kind of figuring out the dynamics and those lines of, like, okay, here's our sandbox, here's your sandbox. What pieces can we, what toys can we share? What can't we, uh, kind of a silly analogy, but really it was a lot of just kind of navigating some of those, and a lot of those people elements that were, um, just like, yeah, how is it okay for us to show up in these spaces? What can't we do? Um, and so it was really interesting, and it definitely a lot of learnings and lessons from that, just in terms of do's and don'ts. But I think the greatest thing is that those it was a very successful venture. It's still going. Um, and I think for the people involved, I think they really saw the ROI, just in terms of, the ability of their own team to better engage, but also, that was one example with the kind of virtual assistant. But the other thing, one of the other opportunities and kind of ventures, was helping, again, kind of big global companies think about, more in the manufacturing space of, there are a lot of people who happen to be disabled that are overlooked in the workforce. And they're not given the same opportunities that, other people might be, just kind of with that basis. And so, really saying, hey, this workforce challenge, finding people, especially to do things like, assembly and packaging, and manufacturing work, picking items and things like that. Um, like, there's people who want to work, and they're not being given the opportunity. There's a giant talent pool that is untapped.
Hmm.
And so, again, worked with one of the largest global companies, and helped them roll out kind of a new workforce at different places all across the country. Um, and so that was very successful. Um, yeah, it's kind of an
Hmm.
interesting thing. But again, well, oh, and I was gonna say that, with after kind of the COVID pandemic and people were working more virtually, we also saw a big uptick in, hey, there's a lot of people who maybe can't come into the office, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, but again, are very smart, capable people that are just not being asked to kind of join the workforce in the same way.
Hmm.
Um, and again, a lot of companies benefited from just broadening their viewpoint a little bit, to say, hey, I think, we're willing to kind of take a risk, if you will, and try this out. And then every time we saw major returns in terms of profitability, but also in solving some of those common business challenges.
Wow, that's fantastic. So for you, what's your vision for let's say the next 5 years, since we're kind of at the middle of the decade here with your own company? Where do you envision yourself, or where would you like to envision yourself being by 2030?
Yeah, so I'm currently working for kind of a pretty, a small-ish social enterprise here in Montana, and one, my goal for them is really, and that is again, they are also supporting people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but we have commercial ventures that do that, that support the organization, kind of the nonprofit portion of it. And I think just with everything kind of happening in the kind of world right now, there is a lot of uncertainty, especially for kind of human service and nonprofit organizations, social impact organizations. Um, and so I'm really leaning into, getting people focused on how do we ensure that these organizations can continue to be sustainable into the future, because the need is not going away, it continues to increase, and so how do we continue to meet that need, and in order to do that, I think being less reliant on funding sources, the government funding sources, philanthropy is obviously a big portion of kind of the nonprofit space, but it can't be everything. And we see
Yeah.
right now that people are kind of tightening purse strings, understandably.
Yeah.
But so I'm all about, okay, how do we leverage business opportunities to ensure that we don't lose that ability to impact communities? Um, so for the organization that I'm working for right now, that is what we're really focused on, is how do we continue to diversify our portfolio? How do we make sure that we're stable? How do we continue to grow and scale, both from a profitability standpoint and from, a community standpoint, and how do we serve more people? I'm also really passionate about this kind of consulting piece and helping other people figure out how to do that well, because like I said, I very much view it as like this is a necessity. It's something that we are going to people are going to have to figure out how to do this well into the future. And so, I want to continue to be to consult with companies and help them grow and scale. So continue to grow my own business at the same time. The
Well,
short
it's,
answer to that.
and I think it's fascinating you say that, right? Because especially, we're again, right? The old way of business was you hit 65, you retire, and then, that's it. But right now we're in the midst of, just the start of the baby boomer generation starting to hit 65, and most of them are in much better health than any other generations. I mean, they still want to work. So there's always been this sort of assumption that 65 people are going to start coming out of the workforce, but now we're finding that people are fine working until 75 or 80, and a lot of them want to, even
Right.
though a lot of them are financially well off enough they wouldn't have to, but they want some sort of meaningful thing, right? And to your point, right? A lot of them arthritis, bad knees, bad hips, right?
Yeah.
Mentally they're still good though, but now we're facing new challenges that haven't not necessarily been there before. So
Hmm.
in some ways, I had this conversation on one of our other guests where we are talking about how there's, like some companies are sort of hurrying to get people out the door when they turn 65, but they're stopping them going. But you're losing 40 years of experience
Right.
when you do that, that you've got like find another way, right? And even
Right.
if it's virtual. So if somebody's listening to the show, or they're reading this chapter in the book, and they want to learn little bit more about what you do and the consulting work you do, how does someone find you? How do they get in touch with you?
Yeah, I think right now the best place to reach me really is on LinkedIn. And I cannot pull my handle up. Uh, and then I'm also in the process of kind of launching a new website for my consulting firm, but we're not there yet, and so I don't have that link to share out. Um,
Well, if you know the URL, you can share it, because by the time this airs, you'll probably be ready to go.
oh, that's true. Okay. Do you need me to say my LinkedIn one?
No, no, just
Okay.
Laura Kneedler, right? Spelled with a
Yes,
K.
yes.
Yep.
Um, and then you can also find me at bellastrategies.com.
Bella, Bella.
Yes.
I like it. Are you the Montana Belle is your strategies?
Exactly.
Laura, thank you so much for taking time out of your day. It's been a fantastic conversation, and I'm honored
Absolutely.
to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me, Travis. It's been great.